Chapter 23 of Miranda by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23 Spring crept slowly into the world again, and one day late in May there came a letter from Dr. Whitman to David, saying that he was just about to start from St. Louis to join the emigration which would rendezvous at a place called Independence, a few miles beyond the Missouri line. There were nearly 1,000 in the company, and this would tell greatly for the occupation of Oregon. He said that a great many cattle were going, but no sheep. The next year would tell for sheep. "You will be the best judge of what can be done, how far you can exert yourself in these matters, and whether the Secret Service fund can be obtained," he wrote. "As now decided in my mind, this Oregon will be occupied by American citizens. Those who go will only open the way for more another year. Wagons will go all the way, I have no doubt, this year. But remember that sheep and cattle are indispensable for Oregon. I mean to try to impress on the Secretary of War that sheep are more important to Oregon interest than soldiers. We want to get sheep and stock from the government for Indians, instead of money for their lands. I have written him on the main interests of the Indian country, but I mean to write him again. I shall not be surprised to see some of you on our side of the mountains in the near future." David was reading the letter, and Miranda, according to her usual custom when anything of interest was going on in the other room, was hovering near the door, working as silently as possible. When he had read this sentence, a sudden queer choking noise, half giggle, half cough, from the kitchen door caused him to look up, but Miranda had disappeared and was clattering some pans in the closet noisily, so David, thinking nothing more of it, read on to the end. Miranda thumped her pots and pans that night as usual, but she went around with a dreamy expression, and every now and again it seemed to her a sheep's head peered pathetically at her from a corner, or blinked across the room from space, and the gentle, insistent "baa" of some woolly creature from the meadow behind her grandfather's barn would make her heartstrings tighten and the smile grow in her eyes. The days went by, and the slow caravan wound its untried way into the west. A long line of brave souls, 200 wagons, cattle, and horses, and at their head the man whose untiring energy, strong spirit, and undaunted courage had brought him thousands of perilous miles to gather them together for this great endeavor. Safely in his keeping went the letter, and with it traveled Miranda's spirit. Well had she listened to the missionary's story of his experiences, and stored them in her heart. There were wide rivers to cross where quicksand and strong currents vied with one another for their destruction. There were fearful heights to climb and sudden perilous precipices to avoid. There were hostile tribes, hunger, heartache, cold, and sickness to be met, and the days would be long and hard before they came to the promised land. Miranda knew it all and followed them day by day. Night after night she crept to her window, gazed up at the stars, and prayed, "Oh God, make it really him, and let him get the letter." Then she went to her bed and dreamed of a strange place of wonderful beauty and wildness, inhabited by a savage folk, and infested with shadowy forms of skulking furry creatures, who were always preventing her as she searched for Allen, just to tell him there was a letter coming. Miranda's interest in missionary meetings increased, and she took great pride in putting her mite into the collection which was taken at each meeting. During these days there grew a sweetness in Miranda's life. She had always been bright, cheery, and ready to lend a hand to anybody in need, but there had been about some of her remarks a hardness, almost bitterness, that sometimes gave a sharp edge to her tongue and a gleam of relish to her eyes. Now these faults seemed to fade, and though she still made her quaint sarcastic remarks about the people she disliked, it was as though something had softened and gentled all her outlook on life, and she had found out how to look with leniency on slack, shiftless people, and even on those who were "hard as nails," which was one of her favorite phrases. She seemed to grow prettier, too, as the spring came on and deepened into summer. Naturally of a slender build, she had taken on a plumpness that enhanced her beauty without giving her an appearance of stoutness. She glowed with health, and her color came and went with the freshness and coloring of a child. Her years sat lightly upon her, so that most people looked upon her as still a young girl, in spite of the fact that they had known her since she was a baby, and could count the time, upon occasion, shaking their heads and saying, "Mirandy's getting on in years, and it's high time she was getting settled if she's ever goin' to be. She'll soon be an old maid." Miranda's contemporaries grew up, married, brought their babies to be baptized in the church, and took on matronly ways. The next younger set grew up and did the same. And still Miranda kept the bloom of youth. Her 27 years might have been but 17, and the strength that had grown in her face with the years had been sweetened and softened. There had been pain of loneliness and disappointment in her little unloved days of childhood, but her happy philosophy had taken it all sweetly, and the merriment danced in her eyes more brightly now than when she had been 10. Her friends gave up expecting her to grow up and act like other people. Only her relatives paid much heed to it, and were mortified that she should so shamelessly override all rules and insist on being the irresponsible, merry girl she had always been. They hadn't expected her to marry, somehow, but they did think she should grow into a silent background and begin to recede into maturity as other girls did. Grandmother Heath and Hannah felt it most, and bewailed it openly in Miranda's hearing, which only served to make her delight the more in shocking them by some of her youthful pranks. But that summer a quiet, unconscious difference grew in her that made even those who disapproved of her doings turn and look over her curiously when she passed, as at a vision. It seemed almost as if she were growing beautiful, and those who had known her long and classified her as red-haired, freckled, and homely, couldn't understand why there was now something unfamiliar in her face. In truth, she seemed like some late lovely bud unfolding slowly into a most unexpected bloom of startling sweetness. Grandmother Heath looked at her sometimes with a pang of conscience, and thought she saw resemblance to the girl's dead mother, whose beauty had been more ethereal than was common in the Heath family. Hannah looked at her in church, and resented the change without in the least realizing or recognizing it. There was a kind of expectancy growing in Miranda's eyes, and a quick trick of the color in her cheek that added piquancy to her ways. One evening, after watching the girl's changing countenance during a glowing recital of one of her own escapades, in which, as usual, she had worsted some grumpy old sinner, and set some poor innocent struggling one free from a petty thraldom, Marcia said to her husband, "I declare, David, I can't understand why it is that Miranda has been left to give us comfort all these years. She seems to me far more attractive than most of the younger girls in town. Isn't it strange some man doesn't find it out?" "Miranda has prickles on the outside," said David, laughing. "She doesn't let any but her friends see her real worth. I fancy her sharp tongue keeps many away who might come after her, and so they never learn what they are losing. I doubt if there are very many men in town who would know enough to appreciate her. There are not very many good enough for her." "That's true," Marcia heartily agreed. "But sometimes, although I should miss her very much, I can't bear to think she will never have a home of her own, and someone to love her and take care of her, as I have." "Dear little unselfish woman," and David, stooping, touched her forehead with his lips. "There is no other like you in the whole world." Meantime, the caravan with the letter wound its long, slow way over the hundreds of miles, crossing rivers which hindered them for days, making skin boats of buffalo hides to carry their goods; and again, with the wagons chained together and driving at a tremendous rate over a ford to escape being mired in the quicksands, discouraged, disheartened, and weary, Out of provisions, many of them sick and worn out, they kept on. Always at their head, in their midst, everywhere he was needed, that sturdy, indomitable figure of Whitman, swimming a river on his horse again and again, back and forth, to find the best ford and encourage those who were crossing, planning for their comfort, finding out ways to get the wagons through when everyone said there was no passage, quietly adopting 3 daughters of a family whose father and mother died on the journey, and finally, late in August, bringing the company safely to Fort Hall. Here they met with the information given them by the trading people of the Hudson Bay Company that it was foolish and impossible for them to attempt to take their wagons through to Columbia. They could never accomplish it. Dr. Whitman had been absent from the company for a few hours, and when he returned he found them in a state of terrible distress. But when he discovered the cause of their anxiety, he came cheerfully forward and said, "My countrymen, you have trusted me thus far. Believe me now, and I will take your wagons to the Columbia River." The pilot who had brought them so far left them and went back to Missouri, and Whitman took charge of the company. So, with many misgivings, and amid the repeated warnings and coldly given advice of the Hudson Bay people, they started on once more. It was late in August, and the new trail over the Blue Mountains was rocky and steep, often obstructed by a thick growth of sage 2 or 3 feet high. The only wagon that had ever before gone farther than Fort Hall was Dr. Whitman's, but with strong faith in their leader and a firm determination to overcome all obstacles, they pressed on their way. They forded more rivers, passed through narrow, difficult valleys filled with timber, and again through fertile valleys lying between snow-clad mountains, encountered severe snowstorms in the mountains, losing their cattle in the timber, and finding the road terribly rough and almost impassable at times, yet pressing on, ever on, until at last, on the 10th of October, they reached Whitman's mission station, where were rest and abundance. Dr. Whitman had hurried on ahead at the last stage of the journey, on account of the severe illness of one of the other missionaries, who had sent a message for him, leaving the company to be guided by an Indian friend. By the time they reached the station, he had repaired his grist mill, which had been burned by hostile Indians during his absence. When the emigrants arrived, it was possible for grinding to be done. Dr. Whitman sold the travelers flour, potatoes, corn, peas, and other fresh vegetables. For a few days they rested and feasted after the hard fare of the journey, and then went on to the Willamette Valley, south of the Columbia, where most of them intended to remain. It was some time before Dr. Whitman had matters at the mission in such shape that he could go out himself to deliver Miranda's letter, but as soon as possible he took a trip to Fort Walla Walla, and timed his coming to the cabin in the clearing so that he might hope to find his friend. But no cheerful light shone out across the darkness, and no friendly form was waiting at the door to greet him this time. The cabin was closed and dark, and when he succeeded in opening the door, he found no sign of the owner's recent occupancy. With a feeling of deep regret, he lighted a candle that stood on the table, and looked the place over carefully. There were clothes hanging on the wall, and a few pelts, but there were few eatables, and the fire had been dead for days. Well, at least the owner had not moved away. But what terrible fate might have been his in this land of wide wastes, fierce hates, evil beasts, great silences, who could know? Time only could tell, and even time might not choose to reveal. With a sigh, the faithful messenger sat down at the rough table and wrote a note. "Friend Whitney, I have just returned from the East with a large emigration. I have a letter which I think is for you from an old friend, and which I think has good news. I am much disappointed not to find you at home. Come over and see me as soon as you return and get the letter. It is important. Yours truly, Marcus Whitman, Waiilatpu." With another regretful look around, he put the note where it would be safe and attract attention at once when the owner came back, then, fastening up the door, he mounted his horse and rode away, the letter still in his pocket. Inquiry by the way, and when he reached home, brought no information concerning the absent trapper. There was nothing to do but keep the letter safely, and hope and wonder. There were matters enough to keep the mind of the missionary busy at the mission. During his absence, there had been a quiet influence of enemies at work poisoning the minds of the Indians. One of the results of this had been the burning of the grist mill, together with a large portion of his store of grain. There was much to be done to get things in running order again, for the passing of the emigrants had depleted his stores greatly. Then there had been a good deal of sickness among the missionaries, and he had several trips to make in his capacity as physician. Most of all, he was anxious about his beloved wife, who had been ill during his absence, and who had been away part of the time with friends at another mission. As soon as things were made comfortable at Waiilatpu, he hurried after her, rejoicing to find her much better. While Whitman had been East, a provisional government had been organized, an executive committee being elected and a body of laws adopted, but the number of Americans and English were so equally divided that little else had been done, each side moving cautiously because of the other, until more settlers should arrive. Now, however, all was changed, for the majority of voters were Americans. There were matters about the government which demanded his attention. In addition to all this, the growing alienation of the Indians was a matter for constant anxiety. There was one comfort, however, in the fact that his own Indians about him were never kinder nor more docile, and those whom he had left in charge of his crops had done their work well, cultivating the land almost as well as if he had been there himself. The winter drew on, and the Indians came back from their wanderings to the station as usual. Dr. Whitman's Sabbath services in February had an attendance of 200 or 300, and his work grew heavier all the time. Some of the emigrants wintered at the mission, expecting to be able to get work breaking land for the Indians, taking their pay in horses, or planting some land for themselves. But the Indians were most of them in such a state of mind that they would not pay for breaking land because it was their own, and they would not plant it for themselves because they had been told that the Americans were going to overrun the country and would benefit by it. They also annoyed Whitman and attempted to prevent him and his men from breaking a new field, lest he should sell his crops to the emigrants and make money out of their lands. Constant daily annoyances began to be felt, and disaffections grew. It was all too evident that an enemy was at work. An important thing to be done was to impress the Home Board with the fact that a grant of land for the mission must be obtained from Congress, or the mission itself would be without a home before long. Everywhere there was agitation among the Indians, and strange, unfriendly stirrings evident. 2 murders of reputed sorcerers among them had occurred not far from Waiilatpu. There was much suspicion of the Americans. The Indians were like children, wishing to have their lands cultivated, yet unwilling to do anything much toward that end, or to pay for having it done. They complained that they had taught their language to the white men, but the white men had not taught them theirs. They wished to have everything the white man had, and to be civilized, yet wished to have it without trouble to themselves. Through all the winter, though many others came and went, the young trapper Whitney, from the cabin in the clearing on the way to the fort, came not, nor was he heard from by any, though Dr. Whitman inquired often, and several times took journeys that way to see if he had returned. So still the letter waited. Back in the East, as spring came on, one evening David Spafford was reading the paper aloud as usual, with Marcia knitting by his side, while Miranda cleared off the supper table. He read a brief item down at the bottom of the column. "Another expedition is said to be about to start to go to the Rocky Mountains. This will rendezvous at Independence. There are 10 women in the company." A strange sense of quiet in the room made both David and Marcia look up suddenly, and they beheld Miranda, standing wistful in the doorway, unconscious of their gaze, with a strange, far-away look in her eyes, the hungry appeal of a woman's soul for all that life was meant to be to her. One would never think of the word fragile in describing Miranda, yet Marcia, thinking it over afterward, almost thought she had seen a hint of fragility about her, but decided that it was instead a growing refinement of the spirit. They both looked away at once, and David went on reading, so Miranda never knew they had seen that glimpse of her secret soul, understanding and sympathizing because they themselves knew love. They never connected her look with the item in the paper, not even for an instant, and they could not have understood, of course, why that should have brought the heart hunger into her eyes. But they grew more careful and tender of her from day to day, if that could be possible, because of what they had seen. The great excitement that spring was the going of Nathan down to New York to take his examinations, and great was the rejoicing and the feast prepared by Miranda the day word came that he had passed in everything, and might enter college in the autumn. Politics in the East were at high pressure all that summer. Stump speeches and mass meetings were the order of the day and night. Banners were flying everywhere, some with pictures of the presidential candidates, others with talismanic inscriptions that set the people's imagination on fire as they passed. Everywhere were bulletin boards setting forth reasons why men should vote for this candidate or that. The name of Clay was on the lips of some, with praise and loud acclaim, while others told of all that Polk stood for, and were just as enthusiastic in his praise. Those who thought and wrought and cared spent anxious days and nights, then talked and wrought the harder. Now the time began to draw near when messengers from the far country might be expected. Dr. Whitman had said that he hoped there might be a chance of sending back word of his safe arrival before the winter had set in, and Miranda naturally had hoped, a little, that her letter might have reached its destination, and perhaps have brought some recognition then. Yet no word had come from Dr. Whitman. But now the winter was past, and it was time to hope again. Miranda began to peruse the Tribune every night, and no word of Oregon or Indians escaped her, but neither did she find anything to make her hope that travelers had arrived from over the Rockies. She had heard them tell how the missionaries were often a year and a half getting a letter from Massachusetts, and she had set her faith and her patience for a long wait, so her courage did not fail. But as the warm weather came on, that spirit look came oftener in her eyes, as if patience were trying her soul almost too far. And Marcia, noticing it, suggested a trip to New York and a few days at the sea. She even hinted that she and Rose and little David would go along, but to her surprise Miranda seemed almost panic-stricken, and declared she didn't care for journeyings. "You and Mr. David go, honey," she said indulgently, "and I'll stay home and clean house. It's just the chancet I been watchin' fer to get all slicked up 'thout nobody knowin' it. I don't keer for the big cities much, and once in a lifetime's 'nough for me. As for the ocean, I kind o' think 'twould give me the creeps, so much water all goin' to waste, just settin' there and gettin' in the way when folks wants to go acrost. I guess I'll just stay to home and clean house, Mrs. Marcia, if it's all the same to you." And stay she did, as cheery and sturdy as ever, except now and again when the far-away spirit look came into her eyes. Nights now, when she crept up to her starry window, she prayed, "God, I reckon it wa'n't him after all, but I guess you'll just have to tell him yourself, if it's all right he should know." Sometimes her head went heavily down on the casement sill, and she slept so till dawning. Miranda had evinced a strong interest in the coming of the mails since early spring, and seemed to enjoy going down to the post office in the late afternoons. But no letter had come for her, nor indeed did she really much expect one. She had told herself again and again that there was no obligation on his part to write, and men didn't write letters unless they had to. He might perhaps sometime write and say he thanked her for letting him know. That was all her hope. For that the color came and went in her cheeks. But her eyes grew bright and her breath short whenever she went to the post office. The summer waned, the faraway look grew in Miranda's eyes, the wrangling about politics went on to its climax, and at last the morning of election day came. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Miranda by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. The morning train came in bringing a few wanderers from home who had come back to vote. They hurried down the street, which seemed to have a cleared-up, holiday look, almost like Sunday, save that groups of men were standing about laughing, gesticulating, talking, with anything but their Sunday attitude. None of them had time to notice a stranger who got off the train with them, and stood a moment looking about him, as if to get his bearings. He was a tall, broad-shouldered fellow, well-dressed and well-groomed. His handsome face was bronzed as if he had been out in all weathers, but he was clean-shaven and his hair cut in the way they were wearing it in New York. All his garments were new and fine, and the carpet-bag he carried was of the best. There was about him, moreover, an air of being entirely superior to his clothes, which gave him a commanding presence. The station agent turned to look curiously after him as he stepped off the platform, starting down the street. He half ran after the stranger, begrudging someone else the right to direct him, and wondering why the man had not stopped to inquire the way of him, for a stranger he certainly must be. But the stranger did not appear to see him, so the agent stood and watched till he turned the corner by the courthouse into the main street. Then he went reluctantly back to his work. It was hard luck on a day like this to have to stay around the station all day, instead of being about the polls with the other men. Passing the courthouse, the stranger crossed over in front of the Presbyterian church, walked down the street slowly, and surveyed each well-known place as he came to it. There was the bank, with its great white pillars and its stone steps, where he had played marbles 20 years or more ago. Next stood the old house where Elkanah Woolworth lived, from whose small attic windows he and young Elkanah of the 3rd generation had fired peas on the heads of the unsuspecting passers below. Eleazar Peck lived next door. They had tied a cat to his front door and left her scratching and howling one evening while they enjoyed the view of Eleazar, candle in hand, come to see what it was all about. There was the store kept by Cornelius Van Storm and John Doubleday, with its delightful collection of calico, coffee, nails, eggs, plows, etc., in exciting confusion. How he loved that store! The hours he had spent on a nail keg behind the stove, listening to the tales the men had to tell. Ah, he could match those wonderful fairy stories of his youth now with stories 100 times more thrilling. Dr. Budlong's office came next, in the same old house where his father had been doctor before him, and beside it was the blacksmith's shop, where 'twas handy to get a loose shoe tightened before driving out to the country on a bad day. There in the doorway stood the same old blacksmith, Sylvanus Sweet, gazing idly out into the street, and staring at the stranger curiously, never knowing him for the bad little boy who used to tickle the horse's hind legs while he was setting a foreshoe in the days of his apprenticeship. Across the street was the post office. Next, the 2 taverns, one on either side of the street, and here the groups were assembled and the interest was centered, for the voting place was close by. The stranger paused and looked about him. Just at the edge of the road stood David Spafford, a trifle older, with a touch of gray in his hair, but the same kindly, hearty expression he remembered when he was a little boy. David was evidently waiting for the return of a slender young fellow with dark hair and an oddly familiar back, who had run out to speak to some men in a wagon. Two excited fellows were arguing loudly in the road. Could one of them be Silas Waite? He wasn't sure. And that must be Lyman Rutherford, with his hat off, pushing his hair back. He couldn't quite see his face, but he was sure it was his attitude. He was talking with Eliphalet Scripture. Tough old Eliphalet Scripture, alive yet, and not a day older to all appearances. That man behind him with the gray beaver hat couldn't be anybody else but old Mr. Heath, and he was talking with Lemuel Skinner. Lemuel Skinner used to go with Hannah Heath. Did he win her finally, the stranger wondered? Ah, there went old Caleb Budlong across the street, as hale and chipper as ever, and his doctor's carryall was hitched near at hand in front of the opposite tavern. How unchanged and natural it all looked, and only he was strange, a stranger in his own home. No one knew him. He looked about with a great loneliness upon him, and his eyes fell upon a single figure standing in front of a billboard on which Henry Clay stood out in large letters under a poising eagle. It was his own father, grave, silent, severe-looking as ever, among men, yet not of them. Not 10 feet away, yet with no thought that his own son was so close at hand. For an instant the young man started as if to go to him, then drew back in the shadow of the tavern again, and after a moment more passed on down the street. No, he would not speak to him, would not let anybody know yet who he was. There was just one human being in all his home village who had the right to recognize him first and greet him, and to her he was going. His passing had been so quiet that few had seemed to notice him, though a stranger of such fine presence could scarcely walk through town and not turn many curious eyes his way, but no one knew who he might be. A group of small boys playing at marbles on the sidewalk looked impudently up at him and warned him not to spoil their game. He stepped obligingly round it, and almost felt as if one of them might be his former self. On down the pleasant street he passed, till he came to his own old home, standing white-pillared and stately behind its high hedges, and holding out no more friendly welcome now than it had done to him in childhood. He hesitated, and looked toward it a moment, a rush of old loneliness and sorrows coming over him, then deliberately turned toward David Spafford's house, walked into the front gate, and knocked at the door. Now Miranda had the house to herself for the day, for Marcia and the children had gone to the aunts' for dinner, and David was to go there at noon. Miranda had taken the day to bake pumpkin pies and fry doughnuts. When the knocker sounded through the house, she was deep in the business, with her sleeves rolled above her plump elbows, and a dust of flour on her cheek and chin. She waited to cut the round hole in another doughnut before answering the knock. The morning sunshine was bright, but the hall was slightly dark, and when she opened the door her eyes were blinded for a moment. She could see only a figure standing on the stoop, the tall, fine figure of a stranger with a traveling bag in his hand. In haste to get back to her doughnuts, she did not wait for him to speak, but curtly told him, "Mr. Spafford is out. He won't be in till evening." But the stranger stepped calmly in as he replied, "I don't want to see Mr. Spafford. I came to see you." Miranda caught her breath and stepped back, surveying him aghast. In all the years she had guarded Mr. Spafford's front door and back door, never had she met such effrontery as this, actually getting in the door in spite of her. Who could this be who dared to say he had come to see her? He did not look like a person who would be rude, and yet rude he certainly was. She drew the door wider open, that the light might fall on his face, and turned to look at him, but he put out one hand and pushed it gently shut. "Randa, don't you know me?" he said softly, and somehow in an instant she was carried back to the old smoke-house and the dark snowy night when the one love of her heart went from her. "Allen!" she breathed. "Oh, Allen!" And her voice was as when she talked to God under the stars, as no human being had ever before heard her speak. The tall stranger put his traveling bag down on the floor, pushed the door shut with a click, and folded her in his arms. "Randa!" And stooping, he laid his lips upon hers. "Oh!" gasped Miranda, and her cheek, flower and all, went down upon the breast of the immaculate overcoat. For a full minute joy and confusion rolled over her, but then she struggled to her senses. "But oh!" she gasped again, drawing away from him. "Come in, won't you?" She led him into the parlor, where it was bright with autumn sunshine and the reflection of yellow leaves from the trees outside. But when she turned to look upon him, she beheld a stranger, tall, handsome, with the garments of a fashionable gentleman, and a look of fineness and nobleness which seemed to set him miles above her. She drew back abashed. "Oh, Allen, is it really you?" she cried half fearfully. "You look so grown up and different." A great light was shining in Allen's eyes as he looked at her. "It's really me, Randa, only it's been a good many years, and maybe I'm a little taller. And it's really you. I'd have known you anywhere. Those eyes, and that hair." He passed his hand softly over Miranda's copper locks that were ruffled into little rings and sprangles all over her head, though they had been neatly piled in place early in the morning. "Why, Randa, I knew you the minute my eyes lit on you. Only, Randa, I didn't expect you'd be so beautiful." A frightened look came into Miranda's eyes. "Beautiful? Me?" she cried aghast. "Oh, what makes you talk like that?" She turned her head away and great tears welled into her eyes. He had come, the Allen she had waited for so long, and he was making fun of her. It was more than she could bear. "Randa!" His arms were about her again, and he lifted her face. "Look up, Randa. Look into my eyes. I mean it. You are beautiful. How could you help knowing it? You're the most beautiful woman I ever saw. Look into my eyes and see I mean it." Miranda looked, and what she saw there filled her with wonder and joy, satisfying all the hunger and longing which had for years filled her eyes with that yearning look. "Why, Randa, don't you know I've dreamed about you? I've always meant to come back when I could, and when your letter came saying it was all right, I hurried off as soon as possible. I've dreamed you all out as you used to be, and then tried to think how you looked grown up. Those eyes all full of sparkle like sunshine on the water where it sifted through the chestnut leaves into the depths of the pool down by the old swimming hole. Do you remember? That dimple in the corner of your mouth when you laughed, and the other one in your other cheek that played at hide and seek with it, and made you look so wicked and so innocent both at the same time. That sweet mouth that used to look like crying whenever I got whipped at school. The white, soft roundness under your chin. How often I've wished I could hold it in my hand this way. And the little curl at the back of your neck where your hair was parted. Why, Randa, I've spent hours dreaming it all out. And it's just as I thought, only better. Much, much more beautiful." But all this was too much for Miranda. The strong-minded, the courageous-hearted, the irrepressible, the indomitable. She who had borne loneliness and lovelessness and hardness unflinchingly melted as wax under this loving admiration, buried her face in the strong arms around her, and wept. "Why, Randa, little Randa, have I hurt you?" he whispered softly. "Have I perhaps made a mistake and spoken too soon? Maybe there is someone else ahead of me, and I had no right—" But here Miranda's face like a summer thundercloud lifted fiercely. "As if there could ever be anybody else!" she sobbed. "Then what are you crying about, child?" "'Cause you come and look so fine and say all them po'try things just like I was one of the Waitstill girls, and I'm only me, just plain, hombly, turn-up-nose, freckle-faced, red-haired M'randy Griscom. And you ain't looked at me real good yet, or you'd know. You been dreamin', and you got things all haloed up like them ugly saints in pictures they paint a ring o' light over their heads and call 'em a saint. But it don't make 'em no prettier 's I can see. Mrs. Marcia's got one she says is painted by a great man, but there ain't no ring o' light round my head, and when you look at me good you'll see there ain't. And then you won't think that way any more. Only I ain't ever had nobody talk that way to me afore, and it real kind o' hurt that it don't b'long to me. Guess I'm gettin' nervous, though I ain't sensed it afore. You see I'd never knowed what I'd missed till you spoke that way, and 'tain't so easy to think of giving it up, 'cause it don't b'long to me." Miranda struggled to wipe away the tears with her kitchen apron, but Allen put it from her hand, wiping them on his own fine, clean handkerchief, taking her soft chin in his hand and holding her face up to his just as he had dreamed he would do. "But it does belong, Randa. It all belongs. Why, Randa, don't you know I love you? Don't you know I've loved you all these years, and come thousands of miles after you? And now I've got here you look better to me than I've dreamed. Randa, haven't you ever dreamed about me? Maybe this has all been one-sided." "Lots of times," cut in Miranda, sniffing. "Maybe you don't love me, Randa, but I sort of thought— you see, when you were just a little girl you always took my part, and slipped me apples and gingerbread out of your dinner pail. I was a great hog to eat them away from you, but boys are selfish beasts when they're young, and I guess they take it for granted the world was made for 'em, till they get a little sense in their heads, and some of 'em never get it. And then you fixed that cream so it'd pour over the teacher and stop his whipping me. And you saved my life. Miranda, you know you saved my life at great risk to yourself. You needn't tell me. I know your hard old grandfather, and what he might have done to you if he'd found out. Miranda, I've loved you ever since. I didn't know it just at first, when I stole out of the smokehouse that night in the snow and got away into the world. I was all excited and glad to go, and you were only a little part of it that I was grateful for. Something made me want to kiss you when I left, but I didn't think much about it then. I got through the woods to the river by the next night, and found a haystack to sleep under till the snow let up. I was so tired I fell asleep, but after I'd slept a little while, I woke up and thought they were after me, your grandfather and the officers. And I put my hand outside the haystack into the snow, and remembered where I was, and knew I must keep still till morning. I lay very still and thought it all over, how you'd always done for me all my life, and what a sweet little thing you'd always been to me, so quiet and out of sight except when you were needed, so smart and saucy to other folks, so keen to find ways to help me when I was in trouble. And I thought of the curl in your neck, too, and the way you turned your head on the side when you used to sit in front of me in school, and the shine on the waves in your hair. Then I thought of the kiss, how warm and soft your lips felt when they touched mine out there in the falling snow, and all of a sudden I knew I loved you, and that I should come back some day and get you if it was thousands of miles I had to go. But somehow it never came to me to think that some other fellow might have got you before I came. You always seemed so to belong to me. You see, I didn't realize how beautiful you would have grown, and how you might have forgotten me off working in a wilderness and growing like a wild creature." "You!" cried Miranda, drawing back and looking at him. "You, Allan Whitney, wild! Why, you're a real gentleman, and me, I'm just M'randy." "You're just what I want," said Allan, stooping to kiss her again. And just at that inopportune moment a smell, loud and virulent, made itself felt in the house. "Oh, my golly, that's my fat burnin'," said Miranda, struggling from the arms of her lover and fleeing to the kitchen. "Just to think I'd get so overcome that I'd forget them doughnuts." But Allan Whitney had not come 3,000 miles to be left in the parlor while his lady fried doughnuts, and he followed her precipitately to the kitchen and proceeded to hinder her at every turn of her hand. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Miranda by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. "I didn't get your letter until February," began Allan, sitting down beside the table to watch Miranda's deft fingers cutting out the puffy dough, and thinking how firm and round her arm was from wrist to floury elbow. "You didn't!" Miranda stopped operations to look at him in wonder. "Now, ain't that great! All that time! Why, the missionary man said he 'spected to get home afore the summer was over." "He did get home," said Allan, watching the sunshine on her hair as it shone through the window, and thinking how dear and good her quaint speech sounded to him. "He got home in October and came right up to my cabin, but I wasn't there. I'd gone to Vancouver. I had a good chance to make a lot of money. I'll tell you all about it later when we have more time. So I went, and thought I'd probably get back in a week or so, but things went slick, and I stayed till I'd got the thing through that I went for. And it wasn't till February. Then I had things in shape so I could work 'em from anywhere, and I went back to my cabin. And there I found a note from Whitman saying he had a letter for me, at least he thought it was for me, from a friend in the East, and it was important. Well, I knew he must be mistaken, because there wasn't any way any of my friends could know where I was. But I took a great notion to Whitman one night when he stayed with me, and I wanted to see him again and hear all about his trip east in the winter time. I knew he was back, for the settlers in the Willamette had brought the news, but I wanted to see him and hear all about it from his own lips. So as soon as I could get my cabin straightened up a bit, I went down to Waiilatpu to see him. He gave me a hearty welcome and hurried me right into the house. Then he left me for a minute, going into another room, but came back at once with your letter which he laid in my hand. "Is that your letter?" he asked, and looked me through with his kind eyes. You know how sharp and pleasant they are, Randa. I looked at the letter, and then I looked up into his face. It was a long time since I'd been afraid of anybody finding me away out there. At first, after I went away from home, I used to start awake at night thinking old Mr. Heath was after me, and many's the time I've dodged around corners in New York to get away from people I thought looked at me suspiciously. But after I went out to Oregon and got used to the bigness of it all, and the far-awayness of everything else, I sort of forgot that anybody could think they had a right to arrest me and shut me up away from the sky and the trees and the living creatures. I forgot there was such a thing as hanging, and I got strong and able to defend myself. Somehow, when you've neighbored alongside of the wild things and the fierce beasts, you don't get afraid of just men any more. But that morning, for a minute, when Whitman asked me if my name was Allan, and looked at me that way, it kind of came to me all suddenly that he'd been east and maybe mentioned me, or heard someone say I'd killed a man. Then I looked up into his eyes and knew I could trust him. I knew whatever he believed, he'd not go back on me, and I determined to make a clean breast of it if I had to. not mentioning any names, of course, for I hadn't protected poor Larry all these years just to go back on him now. And anyhow, I didn't seem much to care. I'd made some money, enough to be comfortable on, and yet life didn't look very interesting to me. Just living on and making more money and hoarding it up with nobody to enjoy it with me. If I'd had a real home and a family it would have been different. I'd have cared then. But I couldn't ask any girl to marry me and have her find out some day that folks thought I was a murderer. And anyhow, I hadn't seen any girl I wanted to marry. There weren't many out there, and what there were I didn't train with. It just always seemed to me I'd kind of been left out of life somehow, and what was the use of living? At least, that's the way it seemed after I'd begun to succeed and didn't have to work so dog-weary hard just to get food to keep me alive. So when I looked in Whitman's eyes, I never turned away nor flinched. I just owned up I was Allan Whitney all right, no matter what he knew. Then I waited to see how he would take it, but there didn't any severe look come in his face. Instead, he just kind of smiled all through his eyes as if he were real glad, but he'd known it was so all along. "Well, I just felt in my bones you were," he said, gripping hold of my hand real hard. "And I'm mighty glad of it. You're good enough for her, I guess, and she's one of the salt of the earth, or I miss my guess. You're to be congratulated that you have a woman like that somewhere in the world that cares enough to hunt you up and write to you. She's a fine friend for anybody to have. Now read your letter." And with that he went off and left me alone. You'd better believe I opened that letter pretty quick then, for something told me there must be something wonderful in it, and when I looked at the name, Miranda Griscom, signed at the bottom just as you used to write it on your slate when you'd done your spelling lesson, I saw your little slender white neck again with the bright curl where the hair parted, and I saw your little straight shoulders braced stiff when the teacher called me up to the desk, and a great big longing swept over me to get right out on the trail and come back to you, Randa. And I've come. I started just as soon as I could fix up things so I wouldn't lose all I'd gained down at Vancouver, because I didn't want to come home penniless. Miranda's comprehensive eye swept his fine new garments with a shy smile of pride, but she said nothing. I had to go back to Vancouver to see to some things, and when I finally got on my way I found one of the fellows in my train was sick and wasn't fit to travel fast. He hadn't let me know because he was afraid I wouldn't take him along, knowing I was in a hurry, and he was anxious to get home to his mother. Of course I couldn't leave him to come along alone behind. He wasn't fit to travel at all, really, and some days we just had to stay in camp if the weather wasn't good, just on his account. At last, when we got about a third of the way, he broke down completely and was real downright sick, and we had to camp out and take care of him. Then the guide got ugly and went back on us. Said he wouldn't go with us unless we went off and left the fellow with an Indian for his nurse and a few provisions. But of course I couldn't do a thing like that. "Of course not," snapped Miranda sympathetically. Well, it was some 6 weeks before we got under way again with the fellow on a sort of swinging bed between 2 horses, and then it was most 2 weeks before we could do more than crawl 3 or 4 miles a day. But he got a little strength after a bit, and we finally made out to reach the next fort. The rest of the party hurried on from there, but the poor fellow who'd been sick begged so hard for me not to leave him that I couldn't see my way clear to do it, so I put by for a couple of weeks more, till he got real rested, and we got together a guide, some more outfit, and a wagon, and started on again. The wagon was one some emigrants had left behind when they'd gone west, having been told they couldn't possibly get it over the mountains. Fool nonsense, by the way, plenty of wagons have been over now. But this one did us a good turn. It was hard going sometimes, though, but we jogged on slowly, and at last got to St. Louis, where I left my man with his mother, the happiest soul I ever hoped to see on this earth. I felt impatient a good many times at the long delay when I was in such a hurry to get back and see if you were really here yet, but I can't say I regretted getting that fellow to his mother alive. I tell you she was real glad to see him." Miranda, her eyes like two stars, her rolling pin in one hand and a velvety circle of dough in the other, came and stood before him. "Oh, Allen, that was just like you. Why, I couldn't no more think of your goin' off on your own pleasure and leavin' a poor dyin' weaklin' alone, than I could think o' God not lightin' the stars nights and lettin' his earth go dark. Why, it was just that in you made me—" Miranda stopped in confusion, and regardless of rolling pin and dough, Allen wrapped her in his arms again, stooping and whispering in her ear, "Made you what, Randa?" But Miranda would not tell, and presently the doughnuts in the frying fat cried out to be attended to, and Miranda flew back to her duty. It was a long, beautiful day. Some time before late afternoon, these two who took no note of time sat down to a delicious lunch together, cold biscuits, ham, apple pie, fresh doughnuts and milk. But they might as well have feasted on sawdust for all they knew how it tasted. They were so absorbed in one another. They talked of all the years that were past, and the experiences they had been through. Allen had actually gone abroad for a year and worked his way here and there seeing the sights in the old world. Miranda told him of the item she had heard read from the Tribune, and they smiled together over the littleness of the world after all. It appeared, too, that there were stars in Oregon whose friendly faithfulness had often cheered the exile from his home. Stars were queer things, knowing the secrets of the ages, looking down from a height so great that petty details were sublimated by the vastness of the comprehension, yet shining with such calm assurance that it would all be right in the end. These two had both felt it, only they didn't quite express it that way. "I mostly waited till I got a glimpse of the stars when I got discombobulated," declared Miranda naively. "They, bein' up so high, and so sot and shiny, kind o' seemed to steady me. They used to kind o' seem to say, 'Mirandy, Mirandy, you just never you mind. We been up here hundreds and hundreds o' years jest doin' our duty, shinin' where we was put, and we hed to shine just the same when 'twas stormin' and no folks down there could see us and appreciate us, and when 'twas the darkest night we did all our best shinin', 'cause folks could see us better then. And, Mirandy, the things that makes you feel bad down there ain't much more'n little thin storm clouds passin' over your head, and pourin' down a few drops o' rain and a stab or two o' lightnin', just to kind o' give you somethin' to think about. So, Mirandy, don't you mind. You just keep a shinin' and they'll all pass by, and some these days there won't be no more storms 'tall. And, Mirandy, you just look out when that time comes and it finds you shinin'.' So I get kind o' set up agin, and come downstairs next mornin' trying to shine my very shiniest, only my way o' shinin' was bakin' buckwheats and sweepin' and puttin' up pickles and jells, and that kind o' thing. And when I'd go back agin at night, havin' shone my best, them stars would always kind o' wink at me and say somethin'. Want to know what they'd say? They say, 'Mirandy, you're a little brick.' 'Member how you wrote that onct for me? Well, that's what they'd say. And then nights when I hadn't done so good, they'd just put on a faraway ain't to home look, like they'd pulled their curtings down and didn't want them pulled up that night." "Strange," said Allen, musing and putting out a hand tenderly to touch the edge of the girl's rolled up sleeve. "The stars meant a lot to me, too. Nights when I'd be out alone with my traps, they seemed to kind of travel with me from place to place, and somehow I fancied sometimes there were voices whispering around them. Friendly voices. I used almost to think I was going daffy. The voices seemed to speak about me as if they cared." "I reckon them was the prayers," said Miranda, with a strangely softened look on her face, pausing in her wiping of a dish to look meditatively at him. "I prayed a lot. I don't know's it done much good. I s'pose most of 'em didn't get much higher than the stars, if they got that fur, and there they stuck, but it done me good anyhow, even ef God wouldn't care for prayers such as mine. Land sakes!" Miranda broke off suddenly, and dropping her dish-towel began to roll down her sleeves. "If there ain't my Mrs. Marcia and Mr. David comin' down the street, and you in the kitchen! Not a stroke done for supper, neither. What'll they think? Come, you'd best go in the parlor. They'll say I hadn't any manners to bring a gentleman like you into the kitchen." But the guest arose in a panic. "No, Randa, just let me get my bag before they come in, and I'll slip out the back door now. I don't want to see anybody yet. I'll come over right after supper and make a formal call. I must go home and see father and the children, now. Do you guess they'll be glad or sorry to see me?" He strode through the hall, seized his bag, and made good his escape out the back door just as the front door was being opened by the householders, but Miranda slipped out after him into the evening dusk. "Allen!" she called softly, and Allen stepped back to the doorstone. "Allen, I forgot to tell you. Did you know your pa was married again?" "Gosh, is he? Who did he marry, Randa? Anybody I know?" "Maria Bent," said Miranda. "She taught school after you left for about 5 years, and then she married him. Don't you remember her?" "Yes, Randa, I remember her," said Allen, making a wry face. "But I shan't trouble her if she doesn't trouble me. Good-bye, I'll be back this evening." And he caught her hand and pressed it tenderly. Miranda hustled back into the kitchen and began a tremendous clatter among the pans, her cheeks as red as roses, just as Marcia came into the kitchen. "So you got back already!" she exclaimed in well-feigned surprise. "Well, I got some belated, but I'll have supper in 3 jerks of a lamb's tail now. I thought you wouldn't be hungry early, havin' a big company dinner, like you always do up to Mis' Spafford's. Did you have a good time?" "Very pleasant," said Marcia gently. "And were you lonely, Miranda?" "Not particularly," was Miranda's indifferent reply, with her head in the pantry. "I had callers. Say, did you know Miss Frisbee's goin' to give up tailorin' and go and live with her daughter over to Fundy? Sarah Ann says she told her so herself." The inference was that Sarah Ann had been the caller. "Why, no, I hadn't heard it," said Marcia, carefully rolling her bonnet strings. "She'll be greatly missed by the people she's always sewed for. Did Sarah Ann say how Mrs. Waitstill was today?" "No, she didn't say," answered Miranda, after a moment's pause while she cut the cake. It did go against the grain for Miranda to deceive Mrs. Marcia, but this was an emergency and couldn't be helped. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Miranda by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. When Allen Whitney dawned on the village, there was a stir such as had not been since the Waitstill girls had brought a fine young Canadian officer to church and feted him for a week afterwards. Allen Whitney, the town's scapegrace, stealing forth from his smokehouse prison in the thick of a winter's snowstorm with the stigma of murderer upon him, and his own father's anathema added to that of the village fathers, was one person. This fine bronzed, handsome gentleman, attired in New York's latest fashion, walking with the free swing of one who had ranged the western vastnesses, haloed with the romance of the wild and unknown distance where heroes are bred, reconciled to his family, acquitted from all his past crimes, and spending his money like a prince, was entirely another. The village fathers welcomed him, the village mothers feasted him, the village daughters courted him, and the village sons were jealous of him. The young man had not been in the town 24 hours before the invitations began to pour in, and Maria Whitney held her head a full inch higher and prepared to take on reflected glory. There was only one bitter pill about it all. She had discovered that the house in which they lived was Allen's, willed to him by his own mother in case his father died before he did. If Maria survived her husband, she could not hope to live in the stately old mansion and rule it as she chose. However, Allen's father was not dead yet, and it was worth while making friends with Allen. There was no telling what might happen to him out there in the wilds where he lived and seemed to intend to live. The Waitstills were the first to make a tea party, as was becoming that they should, and they were closely followed by the Van Storms, the Rutherfords, and all the other notables of the town. For a couple of weeks Allen accepted these civilities amiably, taking them as a sign that the town was repenting for all its past judgment of himself. He went agreeably to all the tea parties, calmly unaware of the marked attention paid him by the ladies, and devoted himself to earnest conversation about Oregon with the men. But strange to say, his indifference only made the ladies more assiduous in their attentions, and one evening after supper Allen suddenly awoke to the fact that he was surrounded by a circle of them, and the one woman in all the world for him was not present. He turned his attention from Lyman Rutherford's last remarks about the annexation of Texas, and looked from one woman to another keenly, questioningly. Why was Miranda not among them? Now that he thought of it, she had not been present at any gathering since his return. What was the meaning of it? Did they not know that she was his friend? But of course not. He must attend to letting them know at once. He would speak to Miranda about it the very next day. In the morning early, Allen was going down the street to the post office, as he had done every morning since his return home, for he had sent a very important letter to Washington, and was daily expecting an answer. As he passed the Van Storms, Cornelia Van Storm came radiantly out of the house door and joined him, gushing over the beauty of the morning and the happy chance that made him her companion down the street. She professed to have deep interest in Oregon, and to desire above all things to have more information concerning it. She asked numerous questions, and Allen answered them briefly. He had keen memories of Cornelia Van Storm's snicker in the schoolroom years ago when he was called up for a whipping. Up to that time he had thought her pretty, but that snicker he had never forgiven, and not all her blandishments could cover her mistake of the past. In truth, his mind was a little distraught, for he was sure he saw a slim, alert figure coming toward him up the street, and his whole attention was riveted upon it. Miranda was returning in haste from an errand for Mrs. Marcia, for it was high time the bread was put in the pans, and if she delayed it would get too light. Miranda hated bread with big holes in it. Allen watched her light footsteps, with their long, easy swing, and the spring of the whole lithe figure, his heart filling with pride that she loved him. The woman beside him had pink cheeks and blue eyes that languished on occasion. They were languishing now, but in vain. She wore handsome garments and cast ravishing glances at him, but it was as if a wall of ice rose between them and he could only see Miranda. A moment more and Miranda was passing them. Cornelia Van Storm looked up to get her reward for the compliment she had been giving, and saw her companion's eyes were not upon her. With vexation she looked to see who might be distracting his attention, and to her amazement saw only Miranda Griscom. She stiffened haughtily and flung an angry stare at Miranda, then turning back to Allen, beheld him bowing most deferentially to her. "Exactly as if she were a real lady," Cornelia declared to her mother on returning. "The impudent thing!" Miranda was never one to be cowed by a situation. She smiled her merriest, and called out, "Mornin'!" But Cornelia only raised her chin a shade higher, and her eyebrows arched haughtily. She paid not the slightest heed to the other woman, and went on talking affectedly to Allen. "It's been so pleasant, Mr. Whitney, hearing all about your chosen country. I've enjoyed it immensely. I'd love to hear more about it. Couldn't you come over this evening? Mother would love to have you come to supper, and then we two could have a nice cozy time afterwards talking over old times." Her voice was loud and clear, intended for Miranda's ear. "I'm afraid not, Miss Van Storm," said Allen curtly. "I shall be very busy this evening. Good morning. I must stop in here to see Mr. Spafford." And Allen abruptly left her, pausing, however, on the steps of the newspaper office to look down the street after Miranda, an act which was not lost on the observing Cornelia. "The idea!" she said indignantly to her mother afterwards. "The very idea of his looking after her! It was odious!" But Allen was getting his eyes open. He remained in the office only a moment, not even waiting to find out if David was there, and then forgetting his important letter, he went back down the street after Miranda. She was not in sight any more. Wings had taken her feet, and she was in the kitchen thumping away at her batch of dough, kneading it as if she had all the Van Storms and Rutherfords and Waitstills and the rest of the female population of the town done up in the mass, and was having her way with them, while down her cheeks rolled tears of bitterness and humiliation, so that she had to turn her face away from her work and wipe it on her sleeve to keep them from dropping on her work. Then the overwhelming hurt came upon her so forcefully that, secure in the fact that Marcia was upstairs sewing and the children were off at school, she turned and hid her face in her crossed arms and sobbed. Allen was wise enough not to go to the front door and rouse the house. He went straight to the kitchen, and lifting the latch half dubiously, peered in, then strode across the threshold and folded the sobbing woman in his arms. "Randa," he said, "Randa, tell me why she did that, and why you haven't been asked to any of the parties. I've looked for you every time, and you never came." But Miranda only sobbed the harder. "Randa," he kept on tenderly, "dear little girl, don't cry, Randa. Why are you crying?" "I ain't," sobbed Miranda, trying to draw away from him, her head still hidden in her arms, her voice all trembly and unlike her. "I guess what broke me up was just seein' the truth all sudden like, when I been havin' such a lovely dream. Don't, Allen, you mustn't put your arms round me. It ain't the right thin'. You'd oughta go court one of them other girls what'd give you their eye teeth to get ya. You can get anybody in town now, and I see it. I ain't fit for ya. I'm just M'randy Griscom, and nobody thinks I'm any count. You're a fine gentleman, and you ought to have somebody that is like ya. You been real kind and good to me, but you hadn't seen them others when you fust come home, and it stands to reason you'd like them better'n me. It's all right, and I want you to know I don't grudge ya, only it come on me kind o' suddent, me not ever havin' had anythin' lovin' in my life afore. I'd oughta had better sense not'll let you think I was any count. But a big gentle hand softly covered her trembling lips that were bravely trying to send him away, and Allen's face came down close to her wet, burning cheeks. "Little girl, Randa, darling, don't you know I love you?" he said. "What did you think I came 3,000 miles for? Just to be invited to Waitstills to supper, and walk simpering down the street with that smirking Cornelia Van Storm? Why, Randa, she can't hold a candle to you. They can't any of them. You're just the only woman in all the world for me. If I can't have you, I'll go back to Oregon and live in my log cabin all alone. I'll sit by my fire nights and think how you wouldn't have me, and what it would have been if you would. But there's nobody else for me, for Randa, you're all the world to me. As for the rest of this hanged old town, if they can't appreciate you, I've no use for them, and I'll not go to another one of their stiff old parties unless they invite you. Why, Randa, I love you, and I'm going to have our banns published next Sunday. We'll just be married right away and show 'em where we stand." But at that Miranda rose up in her might and protested, the tears and smiles chasing each other down her cheeks. Indeed, she couldn't be married yet, she hadn't her things ready, and she couldn't and wouldn't be married without being ready. Neither would she have him tell the community yet. If he felt that way, she was content. Let them keep their secret a little longer, and not have the whole town staring and gossiping. He held her in his arms and kissed the tears away, bringing out the dimples. Then he made her sit down and tell him just what she would do. He must go back in the spring at the latest, for he had promised Dr. Whitman he would come with answers from the government at Washington, and also to accompany and advise some more emigrants who were going to Oregon. Would she go with him? This question happily settled, they came to their senses after a time, and Miranda went on with her kneading, while Allen hurried after his belated mail. Miranda began that very night to work at her trousseau, and before she slept she broke the news of her engagement to Marcia, who laughed and cried over her, and then set to work to help her in earnest, the while sorrowfully contemplating a future without her. Allen went to Washington the very next day on diplomatic business for Oregon, not knowing how long he must stay, but promising to return soon. In truth, he did not come back until the middle of March, except for a few days at Christmas, which he spent mainly at the Spafford home, and it was rumored through the town that he and David Spafford were working together for some mysterious political affairs pertaining to annexation. The girls admired Allen all the more because of his abstracted manner and distant ways, and strove the harder to gain his attention. But none of them, not even the keen-eyed Cornelia, suspected that the main part of his visit was not in the Spafford library with David, but in the dining room with Miranda, whose strong sense of the fitness of things would not permit her to take possession of any higher room in the house than the dining room. In those days Miranda sang about her work like a bird, and day by day grew younger and more beautiful. Her eyes shone like the stars that had taught her so many years. Her cheeks were pink and white like the little blush roses that grew around the front stoop trellis. She set fine stitches in her garments, finished a wonderful quilt she was piecing, and dreamed her beautiful dreams. Whenever she went about the village and met any of the girls who were interested in Allen, she looked at them half pityingly. No more did their haughty ways and silly airs about him hurt her. She knew in her heart that he was hers, by all the rights of God and man. He had loved her long as she had loved him, and he wanted no other. She could afford to pity and be kind. So she answered their questions about him, they little thinking that they were talking to his future wife. "Yes, Mr. Whitney's going back to Oregon," she told a group of them at the apple paring, when they gathered around her to ply with questions, while they let her do most of the work. "I heerd him say he couldn't stay away from there very long. He misses the animals and Injuns a lot. Getting used to 'em that way makes it hard, you know. It's real good of you all to be so kind and nice to him now when he went away from here in disgrace. I was thinking that over to myself the other night, and I says to myself, 'M'randy, just see what a difference.' Why, I can remember when Allen Whitney wasn't much thought of in this town. He was shut up in my grandpa's smokehouse for murder, and everybody couldn't say too much agin him, and now here he comes back, having traveled, and made a lot of money, in fit bars and coyotes and wildcats and things, and everybody's as nice as pie and ready to forgive him. It does beat all what a difference a bit of money makes, and a handsome face. He's the same Allen Whitney. Why didn't you make a fuss over him afore?" "M'randy Griscom, I think you're perfectly dreadful, mentioning things like that about a respectable young man. Bringing up things he did when he was a child, and horribly exaggerating them anyway. They didn't shut him up for murder at all. They only arrested him because he had a gun, and they wanted to find out where he got it and trace the murderer." "Well, now, is that so?" said Miranda innocently. "Why, ain't it real strange I never heard of that before? Me living in grandpa's house all that time, too. Well, now, I'm pleased to know it. Well, beats all what time will do. There might be some more things come out some day, who knows? Cornelia, ain't you cutting them apples pretty thick?" Cut them yourself, then," said Cornelia vexedly, throwing down her knife. "I'm sure such work never was very agreeable to me anyway. I s'pose you've had more experience." "Perhaps I have," said Miranda cheerfully. "But I advise you," snapped Cornelia as she turned away, "not to talk about things you don't know anything about, or you'll get into trouble. It's never wise to talk about things you're not acquainted with." "No," said Miranda, "that's a fact, it ain't. I wouldn't if I was you." "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothin'," said Miranda. "Don't get riled. P'raps you'll understand one of these days." The matter that detained Allen Whitney in Washington had to do with the passage of a bill in behalf of Oregon, and his quiet vigilance and convincing words did much to further the interests of Oregon. It did him good to be in touch with things at their fountainhead. His heart thrilled when he met great men, recognizing the things they stood for and the questions that were going to stir the country in the coming years. He felt also deep hope for his own adopted territory in the far West, and his young, strong enthusiasm moved many great minds to look into matters and to put the weight of their influence on his side. Letters passed between him and Miranda, many and often, but by reason of the precaution the lovers took to send all their letters enclosed to or from David Spafford, no word of the correspondence leaked out, though the postmistress knew the affairs of the neighborhood. Miranda had a shrinking from having her sweet secret bandied about the town, which had given both herself and Allen such rough handling and unkind judgment, and Allen understood and agreed with her. They were not always long letters, for the two writers were more than busy, but they were wonderful in a way, for they breathed a deep and abiding confidence in one another, and a wide revealing each of his own soul for the other to see, and thus they grew to know one another better, and to bridge the years of their separation by a knowledge of each other in preparation for the long road they hoped to travel together. The very day before Allen came back finally from Washington, a wonderful event came to pass, in which both for its own sake and because Dr. Whitman and David Spafford were so enthusiastic about it, Allen took deep interest. This event was the flashing of the first message sent by Professor Morse's electric telegraph on the new test line that had just been completed from Baltimore to Washington. Allen always counted himself most fortunate to have been among those who witnessed the sending of that first message, "What hath God wrought?" over the wires, and when he returned he had a great story to tell to those who gathered that night around David Spafford's supper table. Nathan was there, home from college for a few days, and sitting at the feet of his elder brother with worshipful eyes, listening to the wonders of his experiences. Miranda, bringing in hot muffins as fast as the plate was emptied, listened too, and her heart swelled with pride that Allen had been present at that great event, taking his place in the world of great men, higher than her highest dreams for him. Grandfather Heath dropped in to bring David a town report that had to be published in the paper, and listened to the account. He set his ugly, stubborn lip that had objected to every new thing under heaven ever since he was born, and fixed his cold eye on Allen while he talked. When Allen at last looked up, he faced the same glitter of two steely orbs that had met him that night so many years ago when he had shouldered the gun of a murderer to save him for his mother's sake. It was all there just the same: Phariseeism, blindness, unreasonableness, and stolid stubbornness. Grandfather Heath had not changed an iota through the years, and would not on this side of the grave. He had fought every improvement since he was old enough to fight, and would with his dying breath. He said to Allen's final sentence. "How did you know they wasn't foolin' ya? As fur as I'm concerned, I don't believe no such fool nonsense, and ef 'twas true, it would be mighty dangerous and a mighty blasphemous undertakin' to presume to use the lightnin' for writin' messages. You don't catch me havin' anythin' to do with any such goin's on. I say let well 'nuff alone, that's what I say. Writin' letters is good enough for me. Better take my 'dvice and not fool with the lightnin'. Besides, you'll find out that there ain't nothin' in it. It's all a big swindle to get money out of folks, and you'll find it out some day to your sorrow. I never get took in by them things. Well, good night." Allen had much to say to David that night of all that had befallen him in Washington and all he had been able to do for Oregon. And when Miranda had finished the dishes, she brought her sewing and sat shyly down at Marcia's request in the library. But presently Rose went upstairs to bed, and Marcia went to see if young David's hoarseness was better, and in a few minutes David the father made an excuse to go out, so that Allen and Miranda were left alone. Then Allen turned to Miranda with a smile and said, "Well, Randa, my work is done, and now how soon will you be ready to take the trail with me?" End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Miranda by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Very decorously they walked to church next morning, Miranda with Marcia, David and Allen just behind, Rose with her young brother bringing up the rear. Nobody thought much of it when they all filed into the Spafford pew, though it would have been more according to common custom if Allen had sat in his father's seat. Everybody knew of Allen's friendship and somewhat mysterious business relations with David. No one thought anything at all of Miranda, except perhaps Cornelia Van Storm. It was David who managed that Allen should go into the seat next to Miranda, and Marcia should sit next to himself. The service went on as usual until toward the close, when the minister stood up and published the banns of Miss Miranda Griscom and Mr. Allen Whitney. A stillness and astonishment that could be felt swept over the congregation in its decorous closing stir. The women who had been fastening their fur collars around their necks paused in the act. The small children whose hoods and coats had been quietly applied were suddenly left to their own devices, while all eyes were fixed upon the minister, and then furtively turned toward the Spafford pew, where sat Miranda inwardly trembling, but outwardly calm. Her face was as sweet and demure, with its long, down-drooped lashes, as any bride-to-be could desire. Her white, soft neck showed beneath the cape of her green silk bonnet, and one small, ruddy curl just glimpsed below wilfully. Her hands were folded over her handkerchief, and her cheeks were very pink. Allen sat tall and proud beside her. Just when the strain of the silence in the church was at its tensest, he looked down at Miranda and smiled tenderly, and she, by some occult power, was drawn to look up with starry eyes and smile back, the most lovely smile that woman's face could wear, full of adoring trust and selflessness, but with a kind of power of self-reliance, and strength to suffer too, if need be, yet be glad. As their eyes met, a kind of glory came into their faces, and all the congregation looking on saw and were profoundly moved, even in the midst of the astonishment and disapproval. It was only a flash, passed in an instant of time, and neither of the actors in the little scene was aware that they had plighted their troth in the eyes of the world and given a sacred vision of their love that had stirred hearts to their depths. Such brief fleeting visions of what life and love may be are little glimpsings into what heaven is and earth might become, if only hearts were pure and purged from selfishness. Grandmother Heath saw, and remembered her own wooing, with strange forgotten thrill, recalled the look on the face of Miranda's mother when she married "that scalawag of a Griscom," and felt a sudden pang for her own harshness toward her suffering child. For the first time since the baby Miranda was placed in her unloving arms, she saw a beauty and a nobleness in her, for gratified pride had done for her what natural affection had never done. Grandmother Heath was unmitigatingly pleased. She had never thought Miranda would marry at all, and here she had surprised them all and taken a prize. The Whitney family was an old and wealthy one, and this Allen had wiped out old scores and made himself not only respected, but highly approved and quite run after by the whole village. Grandmother Heath drew a long breath and swelled up satisfiedly in her pew. Hannah Heath dropped her pretty lower lip in almost childish amazement for a moment, then preened herself and tried to look as if she had known of the engagement for years, and was enjoying the surprise of everybody now. Cornelia Van Storm, her admiring eyes glued to Allen's handsome shoulders during the whole service, had the full credit of the smile that passed between the lovers, and cast angry, jealous eyes at Miranda, biting her lips to keep back the mortified tears. Yet she knew in her heart that the love between these two was unusual, and that there was little likelihood that any man would ever look at her like that. It was a revelation to poor, spoiled Cornelia, both of her own selfish heart, incapable of loving anybody as Miranda did, and of the fact that there was such love in the world. Nathan Whitney, Sr., at the end of his pew across the aisle, beside his sharp, unpleasant wife, lifted his expressionless countenance like a metal mask that had no power to show the inner man, and with his cold eyes saw the delicate face of Miranda gloried with that smile. No one could have told what he was thinking as he dropped his gaze emotionlessly, and meditated on the irony of a fate that gave the prize he so much coveted to his own son. But to Maria, his wife, no kindly mask was given to veil her chagrin from prying eyes. Maria had always been jealous and scornful of Miranda, for she had learned of her husband's attentions before his marriage to herself, and had been mortified that she had been a second choice with such a rival as Miranda Griscom. She despised Miranda for her father's sake, and because she occupied the position of helper in David Spafford's home. Maria could not conceal her vexation. The appalling fact that if her husband died, she might have to contend with Miranda for the home she now occupied, confronted her, and she had never been an adept at self-control. She felt that her only revenge lay in letting Miranda see that she resented her boldness in setting up to be good enough for Allen. However, for the most part, the congregation, when they recovered from their first astonishment, made out to realize that the match was a good one from both sides, although so unexpected. At the church door they crowded around to congratulate the two, expressing their astonishment in hushed Sabbath tones. It was almost pitiful to see the pride with which Grandmother Heath and Hannah pressed complacently up to share in the glory of the occasion. Miranda took her grandmother's newly developed affection gently, as if love were too precious a thing to be scorned, even when it came too late. But her old mischievousness returned upon her when she saw Hannah, and she could not forbear calling out clearly, so that those around could hear, "Mornin', Hannah. Kinda took you by s'prise, didn't I?" Then with a smile at the discomfited Hannah, and a sly wink at Nathan, who stood grinning appreciatively by with Rose, she took Allen's arm and walked proudly humble down the street, her time of recognition come at last. Yet it had not brought the triumphant elation she had expected, only deep, deep joy. Grandmother Heath did not stop at anything when she got started, and during the next 2 weeks Marcia thought she understood where Miranda got her tendency to stretch the truth upon occasion. For somehow Grandmother Heath gave out the impression that her beloved granddaughter Miranda was going as a missionary, and she actually set the missionary society to sewing on that quilt that Miranda had suggested for the Indians, only the quilt was now destined for Miranda instead of the Indians. There were many extra sessions of the missionary society in the houses of the different members, and the interest in the North American Indians grew visibly. An actual missionary in their midst was a wonderful incentive. When Marcia heard that Miranda was supposed to be going as a missionary, she tried pleasantly to make plain that this was a mistake, but was met with such indignant replies on every hand that she refrained from further enlightenment. After all, what was the harm in their thinking so, when old Mrs. Heath seemed so set on it? Miranda would undoubtedly be a missionary wherever she went, though not perhaps the kind the American Board usually sent out. When Miranda heard of it, she sat down weakly in the big rocking chair and laughed till she cried. "Oh, Mrs. Marcia, now ain't that the funniest you ever heard tell 'bout? Me teachin' the Injuns! Golly! I never thought they'd think I was even good enough to be scalped by an Injun. Ain't that the very funniest you ever heard? And Grandma! Did you ever see the beat of her? She'll be havin' horseflesh on the dinner table next, just to kind of get used to bein' related to a missionary. Golly! I never thought I'd get there. A missionary! Well, I am beat!" Both Miranda and Allen wished to have the wedding a very quiet affair, for they planned to take the stagecoach immediately as soon as the ceremony was over, and cut across the country to join the emigration party. Allen had already arranged for their outfit and had everything in readiness for their comfort on the way. But when the missionary idea took hold of the town, there was no having things quiet. The people had determined to make as much of the occasion as possible. So there was a large wedding, and by reason of the interest the missionary society took in the affair, the suggestion was made that the ceremony be in the church. When this idea was first suggested to Miranda, she looked startled, and then a sudden softened glory grew in her eyes. Wasn't it just like the God of the stars to lend her his house to be married in, when she hadn't any earthly father's house of her own? And then it sort of seemed to set the seal of respectability and forgiveness on her and Allen, and sanctify their union, they two who had been so long left outside the pale, as it were. And so it was arranged. Maria Bent did not like it. It took all the glory away from her, whose schoolhouse wedding was still talked of in the annals of the village gossip. Some of the girls who had been ignored by Allen Whitney did not like it. They said they did not see what right Miranda Griscom had to be married in the church, just because she was going to be a missionary. And Cornelia Van Storm tossed her head and put in with, "You know she isn't really a missionary. That's all poppycock. Allen Whitney is nothing but a common fur trader after all." It was a beautiful, solemn, simple wedding. The wedding breakfast was prepared by the bride herself and eaten by the relatives and intimate friends of both families at high noon. They went away early so that the bride might have plenty of time to get ready for the journey. Then, late in the afternoon, when the spring shadows were beginning to lengthen on the new grass, and the fresh young leaves on the trees to wave their yellow greenery sleepily as if they were tired of the day, they heard the silvery sound of the horn, and saw the old red stage coming down the street. Miranda was all ready, seated on the front stoop with her bandbox beside her, but the last minute was all confusion after all, for Allen and the children rushed back into the house for something they had forgotten, and Miranda, everything done that could be done, turned and looked back at the house that had been her dear home for so many years, finding unexpected tears in her eyes and throat. Then, before she could realize what was happening, she found herself enfolded in Marcia's arms, and Marcia was kissing her and whispering in her ear, "Oh, Miranda, Miranda, my dear, dear sister, however am I going to do without you?" Then indeed did Miranda give way and cry on Marcia's shoulder for the space of half a second. "I guess it's me'll be asking that about you many times," she sniffed, trying to straighten up and smile as Allen came hurrying down the steps with David, and the children rushing behind, their hands full of violets they had picked for her to take along. Then they all said good-bye again, the horn sounded, and they were seated in the old stage, Miranda and Allen, riding off together out into the great world of life. Everywhere along the way were friendly faces, waving handkerchiefs, and cheery words of well-wishing. There was Grandmother Heath at her gate, actually a smile on her wrinkled old face, and Grandfather Heath at the door behind her, waving a stiff old hand. "Seems like 'twas just some fool dream I was dreamin', and I'd wake up pretty soon and find 'twasn't me 'tall," whispered Miranda through the happy tears. "No, it's a blessed reality," assured Allen in a low tone so that their fellow travelers could not hear. Then they went around a curve and down the hill on the old corduroy road and were lost to the sight of the village. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Miranda by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. A few days later, out on the trail they started. Quite a company of them, men, women, and children, with Allen as captain of the party, and Miranda, her new role of missionary already begun, as comforter-in-chief to all of them. The tears were all forgotten now in the joy that had dawned upon her. To love and to be loved, to be with her beloved all the time, to be able to plan and look ahead to their home together, that was happiness enough for Miranda. The journey, hard and laborious to some, was one grand, continuous picnic to her. Not much of play had come to her childhood, save as she stole it by the way and suffered for it afterwards in hard words, cold looks, and deprivations. The fun she had wrenched from life had been of her own manufacture. The flowers, the birds, the trees she loved had often been too far away from duty for her to enjoy, and the adventures she had experienced had all been in rescuing those she loved from unhappiness. But now all this was changed. Here was sky wide and limitless. Here were trees in profusion, and birds in the poetry of their existence setting up new homes on every hand, lofty branch or humble bushes. Here were carpets of bloom in their passing. Here were rivers deep and wide and difficult to be forded, with all the excitement and delight that any child could wish. Miranda did not shrink from the crossings, no matter what the peril. She rode her horse like a man, on occasion, and scorned the wagons if she might ride by her husband's side. To ride and swim her horse across a river became one of her great ambitions. For Miranda had returned to her childhood, and was sipping all the innocent delights and excitements her untamed nature craved. And Allen was proud of her. Like two children they rode together, taking the perils and the hardships. Never once did Miranda's heart turn back with longing to the East. She was a true pioneer, and looked forward with joy to the cabin in the clearing. What need had she to be homesick? She had her beloved with her, and the same stars were overhead. She carried her home where she went. Behind her in the wagon and on the pack mules were her treasures, gifts of the dear ones at home, and not the least among them was a bundle of quilts wrought in many colors and curious designs. One highly prized from the Missionary Society was curiously fashioned in flaming red and yellow in the famous Rising Sun pattern. But the one she loved the best was pink and white in wild rose pattern, with many prickings of the finger, the work of little Rose Spafford's childish days. At night, as often as she could, she slept in the open, and lay long looking up at the starry dome above her, murmuring softly now and then, with folded hands and reverent look, "Thanks be, thanks be, thanks be." Slowly the days and weeks crept by, and the caravan wound its difficult snail-like way along the trail. Sickness came to some, weariness and weakness. Buffaloes were not found as soon as hoped, and the provisions grew short, so that hunger stalked beside them in the way. Rivers were swollen and disputed their passing. Untimely snowstorms overtook them in the mountains. Wagons broke down and had to be mended or abandoned. Indians with hostile men appeared and shadowed them for a distance. Death even entered their ranks and took a little child and its mother. Discouragements were flung at them by unfriendly ones along the way. Yet never in all the long weeks did Miranda lose courage or grow faint-hearted. She was riding upon the high places of the earth, and she knew it and was glad. She was writing a letter to send home to Marcia, a long diary letter such as Marcia had suggested. It would not be finished till she reached her destination, and it might not get back home for a year or two. There was no telling. But it gave Miranda a cheery, happy feeling around her heart to write it, as if she were looking in upon the dear ones at home for a little while. That letter was worth reading. It reached Marcia almost a year and a half from the day of the wedding, and brought tears and smiles and much delight to all who read it. It was so absolutely Miranda-ish. Dear Mrs. Marcia in particular, and Mr. David if he cares, and of course Rose and little Davy, and then anybody else you want. Well, we're started, and you'd laugh to kill if you could see us. A long line of wagons with white pillar cases over 'em looks for all the world like a big wash day hung out to dry. I couldn't ride inside of 'em for anythin', but I s'pose they're all right for them as likes 'em. I don't think much of the women in this set. They don't have much manners, or else they got too much, and ain't got no strength. You ought to have a pretty good mixture of manners and strength if you want to get on in this world. There's one real pretty little thin, she's most cried her eyes out already. I don't know what she come fer, nelse she had to. Her husband so sot on goin'. And a lot of 'em jerk their children round like they was a bag of meal. Poor little souls! I'm doin' what I kin to make up for it. I'm dreadful glad you put in all them sugar plums. They come in handy now. I don't guess the Injuns'll have many left when I get there. We passed a river this mornin', great shinin' thing like a silver ribbon windin' round amongst the green valley. God must 'a' had a good time makin' thins. I sensed it some today when I was lookin' at that river and that valley all lyin' there so pretty. Seemed he must 'a' felt most like I do when I'd get a whole row of pies and cakes and thins made for the minister's donation party, plum and mince and punkin and apple and custard and fruit, real black, and a big fine marble cake. Do you s'pose it could seem that way to him? We crossed a river with quicksands yesterday, and had to lock the wagons together with chains. Dr. Whitman taught 'em how to do it, they say. He's a great man. You'd oughta see us. It's real interestin'. I'll tell you how it is. Every night there's 5 men on guard, and 5 more in the daytime. At night the wagons is ranged in a round circle, and the mules and horses tied inside. Every mornin' they let 'em outside a while to feed. Then they have to be cotched and saddled. It takes a while. Every man he's so many things to do and knows his work. They have to put on a powder flask and knife in their belt and their gun afore 'em when they start each day. Onct we rode 9 hours without stoppin'. We generally take 2 hours noonin', turn out the animals, get dinner, wash dishes and that like. At night we pitch tents, spread buffalo skins on the ground, then oilcloth for a floor, and fix our thins around out of the way, leavin' a place in the middle to eat. There was some Injuns came around, and most of the women got scared. I didn't see much to 'em to be scared 'bout. They look dirty to me, and don't have 'nough clothes to their backs. The letter went on to tell the daily occurrences of the way, noting the places and the incidents, and one notable extract touched Marcia's heart more than all the rest. Well, we come to a mounting this mornin', a real live mounting. It's thar yet, right in front of me. I got my dishes all washed, and I'm restin' and lookin' at it by spells. You don't never need to go any further to wonder ef you wunst see a mounting. It's the biggest, comfortablest, settlest thin' you ever could 'a' thought of. It just sets right there, never stirs, never seems to mind what happens round it, or what goes over it. Can't disturb him, he's a mounting. Might cut down all his forests, he wouldn't care, he'd grow some more. Might walk over him all day and annoy him a lot, he just sets there and looks up, and by all them that annoys passes on, and there's the mounting yet, just same, and he knew 'twould be so, 'cause he's a mounting. He can't die. They can't nobody move him, he's too big. 'Cept maybe God might, but God made him, so he don't care 'bout that, 'cause if God could make him, God wouldn't spoil him, and if he moved him, he'd just put him in a better place, so what's that? Men might cut a hole in him, but 'twould take so long, and be s'little, 'twouldn't amount to much. Mounting's there just same. He's a mounting, and he looks like he knowed it, and yet 'tain't hurt him none, he's just as kind and considerate and comfortable, and yes, real purty like, all soft fringes of trees at the bottom, and all sharp points white frostin' of snow up top against the sky, shinin' silver in the mornin' and the moon, towerin' up over you kind o' big, and growin' soft and purply with a wreath o' haze round his feet at night. He's a mounting! And God must have been real pleased when he got him done. He must have been most pleased of all when he made a mounting. I'm real glad he made 'em, and glad I lived to see one. When you must come this way and see my mounting. They say there's going to be some more 'fore we get through, but I don't believe none of 'em'll be so pretty as this." The rest of the letter told of the further experiences and the homecoming, first to Waiilatpu, where they were welcomed with open arms by the missionaries, and kept and rested a while, and then to the cabin where they had a beautiful time beginning to keep house, and where Miranda's descriptions of the house and her attempts to fix it up to her mind were laughable. Marcia, after they had enjoyed the letter thoroughly at home, took it with her in her pocket wherever she went, and let Miranda's many friends enjoy it also. She carried it first with her when David took them out on a drive, Marcia on the back seat with her daughter Rose, who was grown suddenly into young womanhood, and young David with his father in the front of the carryall. They drove straight to the house of Hannah Skinner, where Grandma Heath had come to live, after the sudden death of old Mr. Heath, which occurred a few weeks after Miranda left home. Hannah and the old lady, both pleased at the sight of the Spafford carriage at their door, came out to welcome their guests, the cat following amiably behind. "I've got a letter from Miranda, and I thought you'd like to read it," said Marcia, leaning out of the carriage and smiling. The old lady's face brightened. "A letter from Mirandy! Now you don't say! Well, ain't that real interestin'? How does she get on missionaryin'? Seems sort o' like gettin' word from another world, don't it? Do get out and come in." And so the letter was read to the two women, who listened in great wonder, and boasted around for many a day with, "Mirandy says this," and "My cousin Mirandy says so and so," until the village smiled and wondered, and Miranda's record of discreditable scrapes was all forgotten under the halo of a missionary. In due time the letter traveled to Nathan at college, firing him with a deep desire to go out west, and when he came home in the spring he was full of it, till finally David said, "Well, my boy, go try it. Allen said it would do you good, and you could earn something out there. We'll see if there are some people going, and you go out for a year or two, and then come back and finish your college course. A rest and a little touch of nature will do you good." As suddenly as that it came, and a few weeks later Nathan bade them all an excited, happy farewell, and started out into the great far country also. Rose, like a sweet, frightened flower, looked after the coach that bore him away, and fled to the window in Miranda's room to stay alone until night fell and the stars came out to comfort her and help her understand. Poor little Rose, with your astonished feet taking the first steps into the path of sorrow and loss. How long the way lies before you, beaten hard by many feet, yet you, too, will one day reach the higher ground and see your mountain. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Miranda by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. For every big bridge built, or massive building reared, many stones must lie underground. No marvelous work is accomplished without destruction and sacrifice, and the greatest movements are often those baptized with blood. Slowly, stealthily, out of the west, there arose a menacing cloud. Shadowy it was at first, like a mote that one tries to brush away from a tired eye, still floating and insisting upon being seen. Low stirrings in the grass, and sounds like the hiss of some moving, poisonous serpent. Forms phantom-like and vanishing when search is made. Gone, always gone when you look. Yet there, convincingly there, but elusive. Stealthy footsteps in the night, prying, peering, breathless. These things were in the very atmosphere. There had been a growing uneasiness among the Indians ever since Dr. Whitman's return with the emigrants. An enemy was at work, that was plain to be seen. Strange rumors were abroad. Silent, subtle impressions, averted glances, muttered gutturals. Still, Whitman and his workers went steadily on, omitting no one of their arduous tasks, not hesitating to visit the sick among known enemies, withholding no kindness even from the stolid and ungrateful. Several times contagious diseases raged among the Indians with fearful fatality. The missionaries were faithful and indefatigable, giving themselves night and day with medicine and nursing to save as many as possible. Finally, an epidemic of measles broke out among them, sweeping away large numbers. Frantic and fearful, they sent for the missionary doctor, though they often omitted to follow directions afterward, or sent for their own medicine man with his incantations and weird ceremonies. Death stalked among them, and the story went forth, from what source who could quite be sure, that the missionary was poisoning them to clear the country of Indians and take their lands for the white people. The faint cloud on the horizon now grew large and dark with portent. Ominous thunders threatened in the distance, drawing nearer and more certain. The mission knew its peril. Dr. Whitman was thoroughly convinced that a plot to murder the missionaries was nearly completed, yet he kept steadily on with his work. Day after day he told his wife and friends all that he saw and what the appearances led him to fear. Carefully and prayerfully he walked, with the light of another world on his face, knowing not at what moment he would be called away from this. He visited the Indian camp on the Umatilla River, called on the bishop and the vicar general who had just arrived at the place, and had brief interviews. Then rode out to where a fellow missionary was encamped, reaching there about sunset. They talked the situation over calmly, discussing the possibilities and probabilities. "My death may do as much good to Oregon as my life can do," said the man who had crossed the Rockies and a continent in midwinter to save Oregon. Though weary and worn, he did not stay to rest, for there was severe sickness at his home, and he started late that night on his lonely ride of 40 miles back to the mission, arriving there at dawn. Then a hurried interview with his wife, a few words and tears of tenderness, cut short by calls to attend the sick. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life." Ever had this man taken the lead in all the hard things, sacrificing, never thinking of himself, plunging into the icy river first, not asking others to go where he was unwilling to lead, like his master whom he served. It was as if God would not take him from the eternal light of leadership, for which he had formed him and called him, and so arranged that even in death he should still lead. While the sun was shining high in the heavens, stealthily, like evil shadows, the Indians gathered around the mission that once had been a happy home, and where the work was still going steadily on as if no menace in the air were felt. Suddenly the shadows sprang from covert hiding on every side. Evil faces, stealthy steppings, flashing knives, and the deed was done. Dr. Whitman was the first to fall. A tomahawk plunged twice into his head. Then the carnage began, and continued for 8 days. The first news was brought to Miranda as she stood at her cabin door watching for Allen. He did not come with his usual cheery whistle, but striding into the clearing with deep sorrow in his eyes, and an ominous look of threatening about his mouth. His wife knew at once that something terrible had happened. "Is it them pesky Injuns?" she asked in a voice she had taught to be low and guarded. "Drat 'em! They's been 2 of 'em round the house this very mornin', and they looked like they was up to somethin'. What have they been doin'?" "They have killed Dr. Whitman." "In the name o' sense, what did they do that fur? Did they want to bite their own nose off to spite their face? How are they goin' to live without him? Ain't he been doin' and doin' and doin' himself jest to death fur 'em? The lazy, miserable, no-account naked creeturs. I know they ain't much but naughty children, but ain't they got no sense at all? Kill Dr. Whitman." "It was not all their fault. Their minds have been poisoned by the enemy." "I know," broke in Miranda, as if that didn't matter in the least. "I never could stomach them pesky Injuns, missionary or no missionary. Kill Dr. Whitman! As if they could kill him! Tommyhawks couldn't do that. Men couldn't do that. Why, a man like that'll live forever. You can't stop him. He ain't been just a livin' body, he's a livin' soul. He'll go on livin's long as the world stands, and longer. He'll live forever. He's like a mounting. Can't touch him. Kill him? Well, I guess not." Miranda whirled her back abruptly round, and let the tears course down her cheeks. But in an instant she had herself in hand, and turned back, her face wet, her eyes snapping fire. "Well, what are we going to do about it?" "Do about it?" asked Allen, half astonished. Then a grim look settling about his mouth, he said decidedly, "We're going to get you out of this terrible country, and safe somewhere as soon as we can go." "Well, that's just what we ain't going to do," said Miranda decidedly. "I ain't no wax doll whose nose'll melt off in the sun, and there ain't no tommyhawk goin' to touch me. We're goin' to get to work right here and now and teach them pesky Injuns some manners. You don't mean to tell me, Allen Whitney, that you would sneak off and take your wife away to hide her in pink cotton, while them dear missionaries is settin' there sorrowin' for him." She choked, but went bravely on. "And in danger, maybe, needin' protection. Allen Whitney, that ain't you. I know you better'n that. And if havin' a wife has made you such a fool, baby, and coward, she'd better get herself tommyhawked right here and now, and get out o' your way. I wouldn't be worth my salt if I couldn't stand by you and help you do your duty like the brave men you are. How long since it happened?" "Randa, dear, you don't understand. It's been going on several days. There's been a massacre. You know there are over 70 people in and around the mission, and they've killed 14 of them already. Dr. Whitman and his wife first, and some of the sick people, and over 50 of them have been taken prisoners. One man got away up to the fort, and they wouldn't take him in. What do you think of that? I tell you this is a horrible country, and I want to get you out of it." "Name o' sense! Why didn't you tell me afore? Ain't you done nothin' 'bout it yet? You ain't goin' to give up and let this go on. Prisoners! Them poor women and children! You got to get up a regiment amongst the settlers and get out after 'em. How about them as is killed? Have they been buried yet? Somebody ought to go right down to the mission and tend to thins. Where's Nathan? Ain't he comin' back purty soon? He and I can go down to the mission. Maybe there ain't nobody thar, and 'tain't safe, so many wild animals as there is round. You go get the settlers together and fight them Injuns. It's time they was taught a good round lesson." Allen stood staring at his wife in amazement and admiration. "Randa, I can't. I can't have you go down to that horrible place, and I can't leave you here alone. I don't know where Nathan is. You're a woman, and you're my wife. I must protect you." "Stuff and nonsense," said Miranda, hurrying around the cabin picking up things to take with her. "This is a time o' war, and you can't sit around and act soft then. Ain't I as good a right to act like a man in a time like this as you hev, I'd like to know? Ef I get tommyhawked I will, and that's the whole on it. It's got to come sometime, I guess, and my time ain't comin' till it's ready, and you can't stop it if it's really here. 'Sides, that don't matter a whole lot. That ain't the way that missionary man talked anyhow, and now he's gone I reckon we've got to do our best to take his place. Ef I get prisonered I bet I'd give 'em a lively time of it afore they get done with me anyhow. Come on, Allen, don't you try to stop me doin' my duty, for you can't anyhow, and it ain't reasonable at a time like this. Them prisoners gotta be set free. We gotta be courageous and not think o' ourselves. If anythin' happens to us, this ain't the hull o' livin', down here ain't. You go get the horses ready, and I'll put up a couple o' bundles, and I'll ride 'long o' you till I find somebody to go to Waiilatpu with me. Hurry up now, it ain't no use argying. I'm willin' 'nough to go back east when I've done what there is to do, but not till then." Allen stooped and kissed his wife, a look almost of awe upon his face. "Randa, you are wonderful," he said softly. "I have no right to stop you." And without another word he went out and saddled the horses. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Miranda by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. In the autumn after young Nathan Whitney went to Oregon, his sister Helena was married to a farmer living near Fonda, and Prudence went to teach school up above Schenectady. 3 months later their father died, quietly, unobtrusively as he had lived, the mask he had always worn not changed or softened by death. What secret emotions he had died with him, and men read nothing from his silent face. His wife Maria, not relishing the care of the younger children who were just grown to the annoying age, packed them off to their Aunt Jane in Albany, and betook herself on an indefinite trip to New York. By the ordering of the will, she had received enough money to make her comfortable during her lifetime, and the house did not belong to her, so she was free to go. She had few friends in the village where she had lived so many years, and preferred to leave it behind her forever. The old house was closed. The grass grew tall in the yard, the hedges rough and scraggly, and cobwebs wrought their riotous lacery across doors and window casements, a lonely, deserted sight for those who looked across from the windows of the Spafford house. Rose had often cast a wistful glance toward the vine-covered gateway as she threw open her window in the morning, wishing she might see the familiar figure of Nathan and hear his cheery whistle as he came down the walk. He had been gone a long while, and only one letter had come from him, in St. Louis on his way out. But one morning in late glowing summer, the cobwebby shutters were thrown wide, and Miranda rested her plump, bare arms on the window sill, and leaned out, drawing in deep breaths of her native air and smiling in broad satisfaction. The years had passed, long in their waiting, changes had been fulfilled, and at last Miranda had come into her own. She was mistress of the great white house, and she was happy. Miranda, Allen, and Nathan had been home for nearly a week, and they had been welcomed with open arms and glad smiles. They had told their tales of terror, bloodshed, peril, and deliverance. They had visited their friends, heard the news, social, religious, political, and now they had come home. The house had been cleaned and polished to the last degree. The cobwebs were no more. Nathan was even now out in the yard with a big scythe, mowing down the tall grass. The Whitney children, Samuel and the twins, were coming on the afternoon stage. Allen was going into the newspaper office with David. Miranda was content. "Golly!" she said as she sniffed the cinnamon roses under the window. "Golly, I'm glad there ain't no pesky Injuns round here. They may be all well 'nough for them that likes 'em, but not for me. The missionary business ain't what it's cracked up to be. I've hed my try at it, and I don't want no more. I don't grudge 'em all the things they stole out of the cabin when we was off chasin' 'em, seeing they left me my rose quilt that my little Rose made with her baby fingers for me, and I've only one regret, and that's the sunrisin' quilt they got, for I don't 'spect ever to get another missionary quilt agin. But then 'twas meant for 'em in the beginnin', and maybe it'll do good to 'em, and convert 'em from the error of their ways. They suttinly need it. Anyhow, I ain't goin' to fret. I've got all I want, and I'm real glad I've seen a mounting. It's sumpin to go with the stars." Her eyes grew wide and serious, and a sweet look came around her mouth. Across the street, Rose stepped out on the front stoop with a broom, wafting the cobwebs dreamily from the railing, and waving a graceful hand to Miranda. Nathan dropped his scythe and went over to her. Miranda watched them, a gentle look glorifying her face, and remembered how she used to come out on that stoop over there and look across, thinking she might have been the mistress of this house, but wasn't. How queer it all was! She was here with Allen, having the life of all the others she would have chosen if she had had the choice. Would it be that way when you got to heaven? Would you look back and see where you used to be, and look at your old self and wonder? How little the trials and crosses looked, now that they all were past. You did get things on this earth, too, stars and mountains and heroes, and happiness. Miranda, in the gladness of her heart, lifted her sweet brown eyes, the merry twinkles all sparkling with earnestness, to the blue of the deep summer sky above the waving tree tops, and murmured softly under her breath, "Thanks be, thanks be." Then she took her broom and went to work. End of chapter 30. End of Miranda by Grace Livingston Hill. Recorded by TriciaG. Thanks for listening.